In the swirling chaos of the battlefield, George Custer's thoughts raced with uncharacteristic uncertainty. A man of boldness, he now faced an unforgiving landscape and an unpredictable enemy. Custer had sent word to Reno, dispatching Lieutenant Hare with scouts for reconnaissance, mirroring the orders given to Benteen. Yet the presence of native warriors was palpable, a constant shadow that gnawed at him. The weight of potential ambushes pushed him to rethink his every move, his trademark bravado tempered by the gravity of the moment. As Reno pressed forward with orders clear, he led his men toward a narrow stream that offered both a barrier and a chance to regroup. The river was icy, the banks treacherous, and as Reno's men approached, the horses hesitated. Troopers dismounted, struggling over the slick terrain, the formation unraveling as they navigated through. Reno, barely pausing, drove his men into the dense timber beyond, acutely aware of the stakes. Each step brought them deeper into enemy territory, every sound amplifying the dread of an unseen attack. Reno knew the gravity of his mission. There could be no delay. His messengers raced back to Custer, reporting the sobering truth: the natives weren't retreating. They were advancing, organized, and ready for battle. The clock ticked on, but Reno kept his men moving, their nerves frayed as they pushed deeper into the timber, surrounded by the ominous stillness of the forest and the ever-present threat of ambush. In the thick of battle, the first signs of native warriors appeared like fleeting shadows among the trees, darting with precision and stealth. Reno's scouts soon confirmed the worst. The enemy was advancing rapidly, prepared for a fight. Despite the mounting tension, Reno ordered his men to hold their ground, feeling the weight of Custer's expectations. The air was charged as his battalion formed a defensive line, knowing they were outnumbered and underprepared. The rumble of hooves grew louder, the forest seemed to vibrate with the approach of the warriors. Suddenly, arrows and bullets rained down, striking men and horses, filling the air with the sounds of battle, metal clashing, cries of the wounded, and the frantic shouts of commands. Reno's men fought bravely, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the swift and coordinated assault. Realizing the peril, Reno ordered a retreat, his forces struggling through the chaotic terrain as native warriors closed in. Desperately, he sent another message to Custer, but communication was fading, and Custer was out of reach. Reno's battalion, battered and bloodied, barely regrouped on the far side of the river, yet many had fallen. In the aftermath, bodies lay strewn, the ground soaked with blood. Haunted by the devastation, Reno knew the day was not yet over. Custer was still out there, facing his own fate. As he surveyed the battlefield, he felt the weight of the tragedy unfolding, a grim prelude to what would become one of the most infamous losses in American history. The echoes of Custer's bold, yet flawed, strategy remained, and Reno's actions, though controversial, were corroborated by testimonies that depicted the chaos and urgency of the day. The full fury of the native forces was yet to be faced, and the tragedy of Little Bighorn was far from over. Sergeant Ferdinand Culbertson affirmed Reno's measured advance, recounting how Reno's battalion left Custer roughly 3/4 of a mile from the Little Bighorn River at a brisk trot. Culbertson described Reno's awareness of the need for speed, balanced by a strategic caution to avoid exhausting the horses too soon. This was echoed by Trooper James Wilbur of Company M, who, while scouting ahead with Lieutenant Hare, heard Sergeant Cook order them to ease their pace to conserve their mounts' strength for the fight ahead. Cook's commanding voice reminded them that their horses would be crucial in a looming battle. Reno's brief slowing down wasn't hesitation. It was a deliberate choice to sustain his men and animals amid growing tension. Culbertson also noted a short pause to tighten their formation, a move that reinforced their unity before crossing the river and engaging the native forces. As they descended into the valley, Reno and his men faced the stark reality that Custer's assumptions of a native retreat were tragically mistaken. Instead of retreating, the native warriors were advancing with overwhelming force. Reno quickly made decisions under intense pressure, organizing his battalion into battle lines as the engagement erupted around them. Gunfire, War cries and the thunder of hooves filled the air as Reno's men, heavily outnumbered, fought to hold their ground. The clash was fierce, with rifles cracking and cries of the wounded punctuating the chaos. Reno, unwavering in his resolve, adhered to his orders, but the sheer force of the native assault soon overwhelmed them. It became evident that Custer and his commanders had underestimated the strength and preparedness of the native warriors. Reno's battalion, though valiant, began to falter under the relentless attack. The oppressive heat and the tenacity of the enemy wore down Reno's men, many of whom were killed or injured, while others ran low on ammunition and strength. Throughout the turmoil, Reno sent multiple messages to Custer, desperately seeking reinforcements. Yet, with Custer embroiled in his own conflict, communication broke down, leaving Reno to face the battle on his own. The battlefield was a chaotic blend of dust, smoke, and blood. The native warriors moved with precision and agility, using the terrain to their advantage, finding cover in every ridge and clump of trees. Reno's men, outflanked and outmaneuvered, struggled against an enemy that knew the land intimately. Each moment pushed them further back, as the native forces closed in, relentless and determined. In the face of overwhelming odds, Reno held his ground as long as he could, but the reality of the situation became painfully clear. They were facing a battle beyond their expectations, against a formidable force that would not easily be defeated. Amidst the turmoil of battle, individual acts of bravery shone through. Captain Moylan, steadfast and loyal to Custer, led Reno's men with calm determination, even as the situation became increasingly desperate. Benny Hodgson, the messenger who had relayed Custer's initial orders, fought with valor until he fell in the heat of combat. His death was a grim reminder of the cost paid for miscalculations that day. As the native forces pressed harder, Reno was forced to order a retreat. Under intense fire, his battalion, battered and broken, scrambled back across the river. What had once been a relatively organized crossing now became a desperate dash for survival. Men struggled to remount their horses, while the wounded and exhausted lagged behind, adding to the chaos. Reno's retreat, though not a complete rout, underscored the battle's devastating turn. The native forces had overwhelmed his battalion, and the confident charge into the valley ended in disaster. As Reno and the remnants of his battalion reached relative safety, the sounds of gunfire echoed across the plains, a grim reminder of the fighting still raging elsewhere. Reno's actions would soon be scrutinized, with accusations of cowardice from some and defense from others like Captain Moylan. While Reno's role in the Battle of Little Bighorn remains complex, the day was undeniably shaped by the rapid decisions made in the heat of battle, under conditions few could have anticipated. Throughout the frenzied movements, orders were given, reactions were swift, and the chaos of that fateful day was palpable. French, positioned behind Major Reno, issued a quick command to Sergeant O'Hara to keep the formation tight. Standing waist-deep in the river, O'Hara enforced this with determination, yet Private Morris, despite orders, allowed his horse to stop and drink. This small act underscored the cracks forming in their discipline. Dr. Porter later recounted how quickly Reno's command had moved. From the order to advance to the river ford, it took only minutes, with Reno's battalion galloping into the unknown. George Herendeen, separated momentarily after his horse fell, witnessed the Crow Scouts' warnings about the approaching Sioux. He relayed this to Reno, a grim prelude confirmed by Gerard, another scout, who had warned Cook. This atmosphere of tension and urgency set the stage for the disastrous events that followed, each decision and reaction contributing to the unfolding tragedy of the Battle of Little Bighorn. Reno's route to the river was fraught with obstacles. The terrain, which had initially been manageable, grew increasingly treacherous, slowing his battalion. Thomas O'Neill of G Company recalled navigating a ravine filled with deadwood that hindered their progress, forcing them to cross a dry creek, a reminder that the land itself was as formidable an enemy as the Sioux. First Sergeant John Ryan, one of the most reliable witnesses, described how, near the river, they spotted distant shapes. At first thought to be buffalo, but soon realized to be native warriors, a chilling prelude to the fight ahead. Ryan noted the challenges they faced as they entered the river, where they contended with a strong current and patches of quicksand. Horses struggled to find footing, and soldiers scrambled to keep their mounts steady. Those in the lead quickly adjusted their gear, but those at the rear had no such luxury. Urgency demanded they push on. Despite later criticisms, witnesses agreed that Reno acted swiftly, driven by a keen sense of the escalating danger. Amidst the advance, Charlie Varnum, one of Custer's trusted scouts, found himself separated from the main force. As he scouted ahead, his re-scouts deserted, leaving him to navigate the hills above the creek alone. Undeterred, he rejoined the regiment, reporting directly to Custer with frustration evident over the scouts' desertion. The Sioux village lay hidden, its location masked by the winding river, high bluffs, and dense timber. Yet, despite their proximity, the village remained shrouded in mystery and danger. As Reno's column moved back across Reno Creek, Varnum rejoined them, only to be pushed off the trail by the rapid pace. By the time he rejoined, Reno's men were already crossing the river, a feat accomplished within 15 minutes of parting from Custer. Despite the rugged conditions, there were no stops for watering horses. The urgency was too great, the stakes too high. The sounds of advancing Sioux echoed through the valley, adding to the tension that gripped Reno's battalion. Soldiers, weary yet determined, tightened their grips on their rifles, knowing that the enemy was near. While Custer's plan depended on a swift retreat by the Sioux, Reno saw signs that contradicted this expectation. The warnings from Crow scouts, the distant sightings of warriors, and the unforgiving terrain all suggested a battle for survival. Reno's battalion pushed forward, facing the grim reality of what lay ahead. The timber began to thin, revealing the valley beyond. With his men in battle lines, Reno prepared for the inevitable clash. As the Sioux forces drew near, their numbers seemed endless. Tension filled the air as Reno's men, vastly outnumbered, prepared to meet an enemy who showed no signs of retreat. There was no turning back. The Battle of Little Bighorn was upon them, and Reno's battalion stood at the center of the storm, with no choice but to face what was to come. The river was behind them, and Reno's battalion had regrouped for the next phase. Reno wasted no time. He reformed his troops and pushed forward, adapting swiftly to the unpredictable terrain. With a sense of urgency driving his every decision, he arranged his forces with 2 companies up front and 1 in reserve, moving decisively along the riverbank. The rugged landscape demanded tactical flexibility, and Reno responded by shifting his formations fluidly between columns of 4s and 2s as needed, especially while navigating Reno Creek's dense timber and uneven ground. His leadership ensured that momentum was maintained despite the challenging conditions. Upon emerging from the timber, Reno ordered Companies A and M into line, with Captain Moylan recalling they had covered about a third of a mile before this command was issued. Reno quickened the pace to a gallop, pushing his men with a calculated speed. Lieutenant Hodgson then directed McIntosh's Company G to the far left, creating a left-to-right alignment of GAM to maximize coverage and prepare for engagement. Meanwhile, Charlie Varnum and his scouts took a wider path on the left, scouting well ahead to detect any hidden threats. The valley, dense with undergrowth, was an ideal setting for an ambush, making their reconnaissance essential. Sergeant John Ryan, stationed close to the riverbank with Company M, formed a skirmish line under Captain French's orders, covering Reno's eastern flank. This move added a layer of defense, allowing Reno's forces to advance with some security. Reno's tactics at this stage mirrored Custer's use of forward scouts to survey ahead of the main force. His decision to deploy skirmishers along the river's edge showcased a blend of speed and caution, aimed at preventing any surprise attacks. Although later criticized, Reno's actions here demonstrated thoughtful command under pressure. He anticipated support from Custer's rear, a reasonable assumption given the strategic layout of their forces. The debate over Custer's level of support persists, but Reno's advance down the valley displayed a remarkable pace, estimated at 10 to 12 miles per hour. Scout Girard noted that it took just 10 minutes from the river crossing to Reno's skirmish line formation. Covering 2 to 2.5 miles in such a short time highlights the urgency they faced. Girard observed that Reno's column didn't follow a straight path but hugged the timber along the stream's winding course. This route added complexity to their advance but was necessary to navigate the sandy, sagebrush-covered valley ahead. Derudillo, another battle participant, confirmed the challenges of the terrain. The shifting sands made movement difficult, yet Reno kept his men at a gallop, knowing any delay could be costly. As they pressed forward, Reno's battalion moved ever closer to the Sioux warriors awaiting them, the weight of impending combat growing heavier with each stride. The Battle of Little Bighorn loomed larger, with Reno and his men at the forefront, braced for the clash that was fast approaching. As Reno's battalion thundered forward, the situation grew more intense by the minute. The Sioux warriors were somewhere out in the distance, but their exact location remained uncertain. Reno was well aware that Custer's plan hinged on speed and surprise, and the pressure to maintain the pace was immense. The men had little time to rest, and the horses, though weary, pushed forward, driven by the urgency of their commanders. The valley itself was deceptive, with its high bluffs and thick timber obscuring much of what lay ahead. Every twist and turn in the terrain brought the possibility of an ambush, and Reno's decision to form skirmish lines was a direct response to the unknown dangers that awaited them. Once Reno's battalion reached a more open area, he ordered a dismount, and his men quickly formed a skirmish line along the riverbank. The air was thick with tension as the soldiers took their positions. Reno's mind raced as he assessed the situation, knowing that every decision he made now could determine the outcome of the battle. His formation was sound, and his men were in position, but the native forces were still unseen. This sense of impending confrontation weighed heavily on the troops, who were well aware of the scale of the challenge they were about to face. Despite the criticisms that would later be leveled at Reno, his actions in these crucial moments demonstrate a commander who was acting with a clear sense of urgency and tactical awareness. He knew the risks, but he also knew that speed was essential. As the minutes ticked by, Reno's men maintained their positions, scanning the horizon for any sign of the Sioux warriors. The tension was palpable, and every sound, the rustle of leaves, the creak of saddles, the snort of a horse, seemed to signal the approach of the enemy. The battle was now inevitable. Reno had done everything he could to prepare his men, but the native warriors, hidden by the bends in the river and the dense timber, remained an unseen threat. The open valley stretched out before them, and Reno's men could feel the weight of the moment. The sound of hoofbeats and the distant cries of the scouts echoed through the valley, a reminder that time was running out. The situation at Little Bighorn was spiraling into chaos, but Reno's actions in these early moments showed a commander who was trying to stay one step ahead of disaster. His skirmish lines were in place, his men were prepared, and now all that remained was the waiting, the agonizing wait for the enemy to reveal themselves. In those tense minutes, Reno must have hoped that Custer's support would arrive in time. But as history would later show, that support would not come. The Battle of Little Bighorn was about to descend into one of the most infamous and tragic confrontations in American military history. Reno's men, poised for battle, could do little more than brace themselves for what was to come. They were outnumbered, and the terrain worked against them, but they had their orders. The gallop through the valley had brought them to this moment, and now the fate of Reno's battalion rested in the hands of the soldiers, scouts, and officers who stood alongside him, ready to face the onslaught. As the adrenaline surged through the soldiers, exact measurements of time and distance became increasingly unreliable. In the heat of the moment, perception warped, making it difficult for participants to recall the events with precision. Captain Miles Moylan, for instance, provided varying estimates of how far they had traveled and how long it took. His accounts shifted over time, reflecting the confusion that clouded the memories of many who fought in the Battle of Little Bighorn. On the other hand, Dr. Porter, observing from a more detached and clinical perspective, suggested that it took between 15 and 20 minutes to reach their destination, a testament to how fast Reno's battalion was moving through the valley. While the testimonies diverge, what remains consistent is that Reno's movement down the valley, though swift, was not a full-out charge in the textbook sense. By the time the 3rd Company had fallen into line, the battalion was already moving at a gallop, a pace that reflected the urgency of the situation. Despite the battalion's rapid movement and Reno's careful execution of tactics, not everyone would later agree on his effectiveness as a leader. Years after the battle, Captain Edward Godfrey, commander of K Company, expressed his doubts about Reno's leadership. Godfrey believed that Reno had faltered at a critical juncture, retreating prematurely and failing to inspire confidence in his men. In his view, had Reno been in command of Custer's forces, they would have been doomed. However, Godfrey's harsh assessment was colored by personal bitterness and hindsight. He harbored a long-standing dislike for Reno, and his views were likely shaped by these personal grievances. When considering the broader array of testimonies from those who were present, a more nuanced picture of Reno's leadership emerges. Testimonies suggest that Reno acted decisively, particularly during the early stages of the battle. His quick formation of skirmish lines, his adaptability to the rough terrain, and his emphasis on maintaining speed all indicate that Reno understood the high stakes. His every move reflected a leader who recognized the urgency of the situation and the need for swift action. As Reno's troops pressed forward, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The soldiers were greeted by an ever-thickening cloud of dust rising ahead of them, a sign that they were nearing the Sioux village. One Feather, a Ree scout, later recalled that as the battalion approached the village, dust was rising high above the camp. The dust cloud wasn't just the result of the village's activity. It signaled that Sioux warriors were already moving toward them, preparing to engage in battle. This sight filled the soldiers with both anticipation and dread. They knew that a confrontation was imminent, and the rising dust signaled the gathering of a formidable force. Sergeant Ferdinand Culbertson of a company also noted the enormous dust cloud ahead of the village. He estimated that between 100 and 150 native warriors were riding in and out of the dust, readying themselves for battle. The sight of the dust, combined with the movement of figures within it, created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Captain Moylan later added that the thick dust made it difficult to discern what exactly was happening, heightening the tension among the troops. As they advanced, the dust appeared to recede momentarily, only for more mounted warriors to emerge from the haze, a ghostly reminder that the Sioux were not retreating, they were preparing to fight. Reno's men had little time to react. Before many of the soldiers could even dismount, the warriors were upon them. The speed with which the situation escalated took many by surprise, and the tension that had been mounting throughout the advance suddenly gave way to chaos. The dust, the movement of warriors, and the anticipation all culminated in a violent clash that would mark the beginning of Reno's fateful engagement. Though we may never know with absolute certainty what Reno truly saw as he led his battalion down the valley, the accounts of dust, movement, and rising tension paint a vivid picture of those final moments before the clash. It was a scene filled with anticipation, uncertainty, and growing dread. Reno, despite his critics, had moved his men with speed and precision, and he was now on the brink of one of the most significant and tragic engagements in American military history. As the warriors emerged from the haze, it became clear that Reno and his men were outnumbered, and the enemy was closing in fast. The soldiers, already on edge from the long march and the looming threat, found themselves in a battle they had not fully anticipated. Despite the tactical efforts made by Reno to keep his men organized, the sheer size and speed of the native forces caught many off guard. The dust cloud that had obscured the village and the warriors had also served to obscure the full scope of the threat they were facing. The clash that followed was chaotic and brutal. Reno's skirmish lines, which had been hastily formed, struggled to hold their ground as the Sioux warriors pressed their attack. The dust that had filled the air now mixed with the sounds of gunfire, war cries, and the shouts of soldiers trying to maintain their positions. Reno, recognizing the dire nature of the situation, made the decision to fall back into the timber, hoping that the cover would provide some respite from the relentless assault. Despite the criticisms that would follow him in the years after the battle, Reno's actions in these moments were not those of a man lacking in leadership. He had moved quickly, adapting to the terrain and the evolving situation as best he could. But the forces arrayed against him were vast, and the speed with which the battle escalated left little room for error. As the dust settled and the sounds of battle echoed across the valley, Reno's retreat into the timber marked a turning point in the fight. His men, though battered and shaken, regrouped and prepared for the next phase of the battle. The Sioux warriors, emboldened by their success, would not give them much time to rest. The chaotic advance down the valley, marked by dust clouds, shifting formations, and rising tension, had set the stage for the larger battle to come. Reno's decisions, though controversial in hindsight, reflected a commander trying to balance speed, caution, and the overwhelming pressure of a rapidly deteriorating situation. What followed in the hours after Reno's initial advance would become one of the most analyzed and debated moments in American military history, but in those tense moments leading up to the battle, Reno was simply trying to survive.